the best and the quirkiest entertainers. Now people from around the country are mourning the death of Johnny Carson. His nephew tells CNN he passed away early Sunday from emphysema.
Johnny Carson was an icon who lit up late-night television for 3 decades, yet his passing passed almost unnoticed by the world in a quiet, private farewell. How could the man who entertained millions leave without a public goodbye? Behind that silence lies a story of loyalty shattered, a friendship turned cold by betrayal so profound that it lingered beyond death. This is the tale of the one person who, despite never stepping inside his funeral, became the most unlikely guest, haunting his legacy. The quiet exit explained. Johnny Carson's death on January 23, 2005, was as private as the man himself. Despite being one of the most recognizable figures in American entertainment for over 3 decades, there was no public funeral or memorial. No crowds gathered outside a grand venue, no black cars lined the streets. Instead, his body was quietly cremated, and the ashes passed privately to his wife, Alexis Maas. This absence of ceremony was a deliberate reflection of Carson's intensely private nature, a stark contrast to his public persona. Carson had been the king of late-night television, comfortable on a stage before millions, but notoriously unequipped for casual social interactions. His longtime sidekick, Ed McMahon, once said, "Johnny was comfortable in front of 20 million people and completely uncomfortable in front of 20. This odd paradox of public ease and personal reserve shaped the final arrangement for his passing. Carson's nephew made it clear, there will be no memorial service. The decision shocked the public, but was entirely in keeping with the man known for guarding his personal life fiercely. For someone who had shaped American late night for so long, it was almost unimaginable that the world would say goodbye with silence. Yet, this silence only invited more questions. Among all the names and faces connected to Carson, one name surfaced repeatedly in hushed conversations after his death. This was no celebrity guest or close friend stepping up to eulogize him in public. Instead, it was a figure whose relationship with Carson had been both foundational and fractured, an absence that spoke louder than presence. The truth is, the most unexpected guest at Johnny Carson's funeral wasn't there in flesh and blood. It was a ghost, a painful memory of a bond broken by betrayal that neither time nor death could fully heal. The story of this ghost is neither simple nor well-known, but it shaped the final chapter of Carson's life as much as his own legacy on television. This was the unresolved story, lingering in the quiet aftermath, a shadow coiling around the king of late night. Behind all that applause and the laugh tracks that seemed to follow him everywhere, there was this man who wanted absolute loyalty. Like, not almost or in spirit, but full stop. If anyone even drifted a little, there were fierce consequences pretty fast. And that kind of heat didn't stay in professional space. It moved into the personal as well. Even with all the different faces who passed through his life and his show, one relationship ended up broken differently. More sharp, more stuck. It haunted the end, even when no one really acknowledged it in public, which somehow made it worse. While lots of colleagues offered tributes and fans placed flowers near Carson's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, the lack of a clear public goodbye left a gap people could step into. Through that gap, you get the story that would outlast the man. It wasn't really about the crowds or the easy shine of television lights. It was about the quiet injuries under that success, the alliances that formed, and the cracks that finally split them apart. Those cracks weren't obvious before Carson died, but after, they turned into this unavoidable echo, like the room kept repeating itself. The world had to sort out the man who made millions laugh every night, and the private figure who kept building walls that almost nobody managed to cross. To understand it, you have to look past the stage and into the inner circle, the people who shaped him, and the people who chipped away at him. That's where the key to the unexpected guest lives, in that odd back and forth of light and shadow. This story asks us to look past the surface and face a complicated truth. Loyalty, power, and betrayal all tangled behind the spotlight, not just sitting neatly in one direction. This is the setup for a revelation that lands right in the middle of Carson's last days. Not someone who actually showed up at his funeral, but the one person who was never really welcomed back while he was still alive. As the quiet settles after his passing, that name remains like the impossible visitor, the paradox of being there and not there, the thing that ends up defining Johnny Carson's legacy. To understand why, we must return to an earlier time, when the relationship was just beginning, filled with promise and glowing with opportunity. The rise of Joan Rivers. Before she was a household name, Joan Rivers faced years of struggle in the gritty comedy clubs of New York City. Throughout the early 1960s, she performed in seedy Greenwich Village bars, often passing a hat for change, sometimes sleeping in her car to get by. Her attempts to break into television were met with rejection. She was banned from The Tonight Show, starring Jack Paar, after just one appearance. Perhaps most painfully, she auditioned for Johnny Carson's Tonight Show 7 times without success. By 1965, at just 31, her career seemed on the brink of collapse. But then came February 17, 1965, a night that would change everything. Her manager arranged what was considered a mercy booking, a last-ditch favor. Rivers walked on stage convinced this would be her final chance. Yet, that night, the stars aligned. She was electric, connecting instantly with the audience and, crucially, with Johnny Carson himself. When her set ended, she sat on the coveted guest couch, and Carson leaned in, telling her plainly on air, "You're going to be a star." That moment was more than encouragement. It was a spark that ignited a new chapter. Rivers later reflected on the electric on-air chemistry between them, describing it as magical. From that night on, Carson became not just a host, but a mentor and champion. His belief in her was real and instrumental in launching her career. She often credited him with handing me my career, marking the start of a long, intertwined path. Following this breakthrough, Joan Rivers became a frequent face on The Tonight Show, appearing nearly 100 times over the next 2 decades. Their on-stage banter was sharp and dynamic. Carson, the unflappable king, Rivers, the razor-witted court jester, capable of making even him laugh until tears flowed. Their chemistry was part of late-night legend. Yet beneath that light-hearted dynamic lay a strictly professional relationship, framed by Carson's famously guarded personality. Carson's gesture of support extended beyond the show. When Rivers launched a daytime talk show in 1968, Johnny was her very first celebrity guest. This public endorsement elevated her profile, signaling to the industry that she had Carson's backing. Over time, Rivers' role expanded. By 1983, she was officially The Tonight Show's permanent guest host. This put her in a powerful position. When Carson was away, the late-night keys were hers. In the public eye, she was seen as a queen in waiting. Rivers showed this unwavering loyalty, like really, always turning down other chances just to stay with The Tonight Show. Her dedication looked absolute, sort of like a direct signal of the trust and bond they had been building. But there is one detail that kinda changes the tone of the whole thing. Even if the warmth and support seemed to shine super bright on camera, off camera, their connection was way more distant. Rivers later said their friendship mostly lived on stage, and that behind the curtains, once the cameras stopped rolling, they hardly had anything to say to one another. This didn't come from pure animosity or anything like that. It was more tied to Carson's legendary aloofness. He was a person surrounded by fame and success, but also intensely private, like he was building walls that very few people could actually get through. Their relationship operated with a clear hierarchy. Johnny was basically king, the benefactor who ran the whole realm, and Rivers was the trusted court jester. No one had to say it out loud, but the unspoken power setup would later become the crack line, where everything started to break apart. Even with the hint of guidance and encouragement, the groundwork under Rivers' growing star felt less solid than it looked from a distance. There were hidden complexities simmering under the glossy, on-air glow, like a warning that trouble was already in the room. And what looked like a favored spot was also a kind of precarious position, with loyalty expected in ways that not many people understood back then. The stage was set for a dramatic shift, when the quiet cracks of ambition and loyalty would begin to widen. On-air chemistry, off-air distance. The relationship between Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers was legendary on television, marked by quick wit, playful banter, and a rhythm that audiences adored. Their on-screen connection was electric, transforming typical late-night interviews into moments of genuine comedy and heartfelt exchange. Rivers' sharp comedic edge complemented Carson's cool demeanor, creating a dynamic duo that millions followed. Yet the warmth and closeness that viewers saw was a carefully crafted performance, not a reflection of their real off-stage relationship. Behind the camera, their connection was marked by distance and silence. Rivers herself wrote that their friendship existed almost entirely on camera, mainly for the audience's benefit. When the red light indicating commercial breaks came on, the conversation often stopped entirely. The warmth never extended beyond the lens. This was not due to dislike or personal conflict, but because Carson was famously private, even socially awkward outside the studio. His circle remained small and tightly controlled. This professional barrier was also shaped by a clear hierarchy. Carson was the undisputed king of late night, a man used to commanding control. Rivers was his loyal second, the trusted guest host who held space when he was absent. Their relationship wasn't one of equals or close confidants, but a structure where Carson's influence was absolute. This dynamic shaped not just their daily interactions, but the limits of their trust and openness. Joan Rivers appreciated this support, but understood that her role was circumscribed. She had to stay within Carson's boundaries, never challenging the throne she occupied. This meant a kind of loyalty that demanded compliance more than genuine friendship. For years, Rivers accepted this, focusing on seizing the opportunities Carson offered while navigating the limits of their personal connection. Even so, this unspoken power balance was kinda unusual. Carson had cultivated a reputation for being distant, which was almost legendary, comfortable with millions watching, but also uncomfortable in small groups or those casual social settings. That same aloofness changed the feel of his relationships, turning what could have become friendships into formal arrangements defined by mutual benefit and distance. Their whole dynamic was fragile, balanced delicately between admiration and control. For Rivers, it was like a professional lifeline, but also a gilded cage. The absence of real personal connection under their public persona suggested there were tensions tucked beneath everything. And eventually, those tensions did become impossible to ignore, even if everyone pretended they didn't notice. Grasping this off-camera distance is crucial because it shows how loyalty and power played out behind the scenes. It also sets up the later, profound sense of betrayal, when Rivers' ambitions started clashing with Carson's need for control. The story isn't just about friendship. It's about the cost of defying quiet rules in the court of the king. Yeah, the king of late night. That distance was what set the stage for the breaking point, when the fragile balance began to shift under pressure from changing industry dynamics and personal ambitions. It was a moment charged with vulnerability and risk, one of those turning point scenes that would change everything, and it did. As Carson's reign continued, the cracks in their relationship grew more visible, hinting at the drama that would ultimately overshadow decades of collaboration. Cracks appear in the partnership. By the mid-1980s, Joan Rivers' position on The Tonight Show began to feel less secure. After years of serving as Johnny Carson's trusted guest host, she assumed she was part of the show's long-term future. But in 1985, warning signs emerged. Carson signed a new 2-year contract with NBC, while Rivers was offered only a 1-year deal. To her, the imbalance suggested she was no longer viewed as a permanent fixture. The situation became more troubling when an internal NBC memo circulated listing possible successors for The Tonight Show after Carson's eventual retirement. Rivers expected to be included, given how often she had sat behind the desk. Instead, her name was missing entirely. The omission was a painful realization that she was not part of the network's succession plans. For Rivers, this signaled something deeper than a simple career setback. She came to believe NBC was unwilling to place a woman in the role at all. Her position as guest host, while prestigious, functioned as a ceiling. Visible but not breakable, it allowed the network to benefit from her popularity without challenging the existing power structure of late-night television. Around the same time, a new opportunity emerged. Fox, preparing to enter the television market, saw Rivers as a major talent who could anchor its late-night ambitions. Executives offered her her own show in the same time slot as The Tonight Show, along with a salary reportedly far higher than what she earned at NBC. It was a breakthrough offer, but also a deeply complicated one. The decision placed Rivers in a difficult emotional position. Johnny Carson had played a central role in her rise, and loyalty to him remained strong. Yet she also felt increasingly sidelined by NBC, the network connected to him. Accepting Fox's offer meant stepping directly into competition with the show that had defined her career. During this period, her husband and manager, Edgar Rosenberg, advised caution. He urged her not to tell Carson about the deal until everything was finalized. In Hollywood, premature disclosure could destroy opportunities before they fully materialized, especially when someone like Carson held significant influence over industry decisions. Keeping the deal secret became a calculated but stressful necessity. That risk was well understood by both Rivers and Rosenberg. Carson's reputation for swift retaliation against perceived betrayal was well known, particularly when former collaborators moved into direct competition. His approval had long carried professional weight in Rivers' career, making the secrecy even more delicate. Eventually, however, news of the Fox deal leaked before an official announcement. When Carson learned of it, accounts diverge. One version claims Rivers tried to explain herself but was cut off. Another says Carson first heard through industry channels or a press leak. In either case, the outcome was the same. Trust between them collapsed. What followed was not simply a professional disagreement, but a rupture rooted in loyalty, ambition, and power. To Carson, the move felt like betrayal. To Rivers, it reflected long-standing exclusion. Their relationship shifted from mentorship to conflict, setting off a chain of events that permanently altered both their personal and professional lives. The Fox offer was more than a job opportunity. It was a crossroads where friendship, loyalty, and power clashed with ambition and survival. The Fox offer and the silent break. When Joan Rivers signed the contract to host her own late-night show on Fox, it marked the beginning of a bitter and very public fallout with Johnny Carson. The Late Show, starring Joan Rivers, was set to compete directly with The Tonight Show, and Carson viewed the move as a profound betrayal. For more than 20 years, he had been her strongest supporter, helping elevate her career and giving her a trusted place as his frequent guest host. But the moment she accepted Fox's offer, that long-standing mentorship quickly shifted into rivalry, and eventually into a complete and irreversible break. Rivers' decision to keep the Fox deal secret until it was finalized was not made lightly. In the late-night television world, leaving The Tonight Show often carried serious consequences. Comedians who moved against Carson risked being shut out of his influential orbit entirely. Edgar Rosenberg, her husband and producer, understood the stakes clearly and advised caution, helping her navigate a transition that had the potential to end her career before it even began. Once the news became public, Carson's response was immediate and decisive. Rivers was banned from appearing on The Tonight Show, not only during his remaining years as host, but long after his retirement as well. The studio that had once functioned as her professional home effectively became closed to her. Reports from the time also suggested something even more far-reaching: an informal blacklist, where guests who appeared on Rivers' Fox program were quietly warned they might lose access to The Tonight Show. That pressure created an almost impossible situation for Hollywood talent. For many actors, musicians, and comedians, Carson's show remained the most powerful platform in late-night television. As a result, most chose to protect their careers and avoid appearing on Rivers' new program. Without a steady stream of high-profile guests, The Late Show struggled from the outset to attract attention, build momentum, or compete on equal footing. Behind the scenes, the challenges continued to mount. Edgar Rosenberg, who served as producer, frequently clashed with Fox executives over creative direction, tone, and production control. These disputes added instability to an already fragile show and placed further strain on both the production team and the marriage at its center. Less than a year after the show premiered in October 1986, Fox delivered an ultimatum: fire Edgar or lose the program entirely. Rivers refused to separate her professional life from her personal one, and as a result, both she and her husband were dismissed in May 1987. The collapse of the show was swift and deeply damaging. Financial strain followed, and the pressure intensified the already growing cracks in their relationship. Tragedy struck soon after. Edgar Rosenberg died only months after their dismissal, leaving Rivers devastated and emotionally isolated. During this period of loss, Carson offered no outreach, no calls, no condolences, and no public acknowledgement. That silence became a defining absence in Rivers' memory of the entire ordeal, transforming what had begun as a professional dispute into something far more personal, painful, and lasting. Rivers later described the experience as being sent to Siberia, a phrase that captured her sense of total exile from the industry she had helped shape. Over time, the collapse of her show and her relationship with Carson became a larger symbol of the costs embedded in late-night television, where loyalty, ambition, and power often collide, and where personal bonds can fracture beyond repair. These moments of betrayal and silence shaped the tragic distance between Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers, a distance that would never fully close, not even after death. Betrayal and blacklist. The fallout from Joan Rivers' decision to launch her own late-night show was immediate and severe, quickly transforming a major professional opportunity into a lasting personal and industry-wide rupture. Johnny Carson, once her strongest supporter and mentor, responded with a decisive and permanent break. Rivers was effectively banned from appearing on The Tonight Show, not only during Carson's remaining years as host, but even long after his retirement. The studio that had helped launch her career and establish her national presence became permanently closed to her, marking a very public and symbolic end to their relationship. The consequences extended far beyond Rivers herself. According to multiple accounts, Carson also exerted considerable behind-the-scenes influence in Hollywood, discouraging guests from appearing on her new Fox program. Many entertainers were warned that supporting Rivers' The Late Show could jeopardize their access to The Tonight Show, which still dominated late-night television and carried enormous cultural and professional weight. In an industry where visibility on Carson's program could shape careers, most performers chose caution over loyalty, avoiding Rivers' show altogether. This informal but powerful blacklist had an immediate and damaging effect on The Late Show. Without a steady stream of high-profile guests, the program struggled to build momentum or establish a consistent audience. Ratings lagged early, and Fox executives quickly grew uncertain about the show's long-term viability. Even with Rivers' experience, reputation, and comedic presence, she found herself competing against an entrenched system still heavily shaped by Carson's influence and the prestige of his platform. Beyond the professional fallout, the situation also reshaped how Carson himself was viewed. For some observers, the severity of his response revealed a less visible side of his public persona, one capable of holding grudges so firmly that professional relationships and former loyalty were no longer enough to soften them. The image of the universally charming late-night host began to carry a more complicated undertone when contrasted with Rivers' public exclusion. For Rivers, the consequences were both professional and deeply personal. The loss of access to the Tonight Show ecosystem meant more than a career obstacle. It represented a complete severing of ties to the institution that had defined much of her rise. The public feud masked a private emotional weight that few outside their circle fully understood. In this crucible of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal, Joan Rivers' story became permanently intertwined with Johnny Carson's legacy, not simply as a former protege, but as a figure whose absence came to symbolize the cost of fractured alliances in the high-pressure world of late-night television, where success and exclusion often existed only a step apart. As Rivers faced this profound exclusion and loss, her isolation deepened both professionally and personally. Tragedy and isolation. The collapse of Joan Rivers' career and marriage during the fallout with Johnny Carson marked one of the most painful turning points in her life. The failure of The Late Show on Fox, combined with the dismissal and later death of her husband Edgar Rosenberg, created a devastating stretch of both professional and personal loss. At the center of it all was Carson's silence, from a former mentor whose absence felt especially heavy during her lowest period. Carson never reached out with condolences or support. That lack of contact deepened Rivers' sense of isolation as she tried to rebuild her life amid grief and career setbacks. While she remained visible in public, she was privately dealing with profound personal loss without any acknowledgement from someone who had once played a major role in her success. Unlike Carson, who withdrew almost completely from public commentary, Rivers had to process everything in full view of audiences. That contrast between his silence and her visibility made the situation even more painful. She often became the only public voice explaining their fractured relationship, revisiting their history in interviews and on stage because no reconciliation ever occurred. Rivers described the experience as being sent to Siberia, a phrase that captured the feeling of emotional exile she experienced from parts of the entertainment world she once dominated. Even small gestures that never came, like a phone call or brief message, became, in her view, symbols of how completely their bond had broken. Despite everything, Rivers never fully portrayed Carson as a villain. She acknowledged his influence on television and on her career, while still expressing pain over how their relationship ended. Her feelings remained layered and unresolved, a mix of admiration, grief, and resentment that never settled into a single narrative. In later interviews, she often imagined an alternate ending where Carson simply broke the silence with warmth and reconciliation, but that moment never arrived. Even after Carson's death in 2005, Rivers continued to reflect on the emotional aftermath of their estrangement. Her voice carried the memory of a relationship that helped shape both of their careers, but ended without closure, leaving a legacy defined as much by silence as by success. The silence between them was not just about missed conversations. It was the very embodiment of a tragic divide that neither could bridge. Haunted legacy and unseen guest. When Johnny Carson passed away quietly in January 2005, there was no public funeral or large gathering of colleagues to mark the end of the man who had defined late-night television for decades. The lack of a public farewell left fans and the entertainment industry reflecting on his legacy in private, without the kind of ceremonial closure many expected. Even in that quiet ending, however, one name continued to reappear in discussions of his life: Joan Rivers. Although Carson had long stepped back from speaking publicly about their fractured relationship, the impact of their fallout remained part of how his story was remembered. Rivers, on the other hand, spoke more openly over the years about their history, often reflecting on both the mentorship he once provided and the rupture that ultimately ended their connection. Her perspective became one of the few widely known accounts of a relationship that had once been both personal and professionally significant. Because of that, Rivers came to represent something larger in the narrative of Carson's later life, not as a literal presence at his death, but as a symbol of unresolved tension. Their broken friendship became part of how audiences interpreted Carson's legacy, adding complexity to an image built largely on humor, control, and professionalism. The absence of reconciliation between them also shaped how his passing was viewed. Instead of a final moment of forgiveness or public acknowledgement, there was only silence. Rivers herself often imagined what reconciliation might have looked like, suggesting in interviews that Carson could have eventually welcomed her back into his world. But that moment never came. In later years, Rivers even visited the site where Carson's ashes were laid to rest. She spoke emotionally about him, revealing how deeply the loss and unresolved history still affected her. That moment underscored how their connection, even long after it ended, retained a strong emotional pull. Because Carson chose a private approach to his death, there was no public closure, only memory. In that space, Rivers's account became one of the most enduring emotional threads tied to his legacy, reflecting not just admiration or resentment, but the complicated reality of fractured relationships in entertainment. Ultimately, Carson's legacy rests not only on his groundbreaking career, but also on the quiet absence of reconciliation. In that silence, the unfinished story of Joan Rivers continues to echo as part of his final chapter. Johnny Carson's life was shaped by laughter, loyalty, and an unyielding demand for control, especially in his closest relationships. Joan Rivers was his brightest star and deepest fracture, the unexpected figure at a farewell he never held. Their story teaches us about the price of ambition and the shadows behind fame. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden tales behind the legends.